asked me to talk about the situation on the ground in Iraq right now. We've been making trips there since 2003, and I just got back in February. My partner Jackie from Big Noise got back last night from Baghdad. And right now, Iraq lies in ruins. There's 1 million dead, 4 to 6 million refugees who aren't returning home anytime soon. 35% of Iraq's children are orphans. Baghdad, a cosmopolitan center for 7,000 years, is a city of armed ghettos that's walled off against itself. Iraq has come out of 5 years of a devastating civil war that has just destroyed and devastated Iraqi civil society. And what the kind of the stability that prevails there now, which can only be called stability in relative terms, is built on not overcoming sectarian division and a reconciliation. It's built on an institutionalizing of sectarian elites. And the US is now arming and funding both sides of this fight. And it's a fraying truce. We see, explosions happening all the time. The current situation in Iraq now, this paradoxical truce built on division, is almost incomprehensible if all you are doing is following the news that you get of the occupation in America. So, and the only story you have of the occupation is the story that we're sold through the media. So I'd like to offer in, 8 minutes, an alternative kind of genealogy of this occupation, the 3 stages that American occupation has gone through in Iraq. So, the first stage of the war is the one that everyone knows, that is most reported on, because it's a time when reporters actually worked in Iraq. And that is, when the neocons came in, they attempted to erase the country. They dismantled all the institutions of the country, the army, all of the government. The de-Baathification process basically fired the entire professional and governmental class, and their hope was that this neoliberal paradise would emerge, that would be friendly to the West, that would guarantee resource extraction for Western companies, and it would be the first of the dominoes in the region to fall. Iraq would fall, and then soon after Syria, and I'm sure that Fife and Cheney and everyone believes that Iran would be the last, guaranteeing American hegemony in the region for generations to come. Of course, that dream was a fucking insane fantasy. And in a couple of months, they were faced with an uprising that they could not handle. When I was there in 2004, they were faced a 2-front war. There was an uprising and 2 nationalist uprisings. A nationalist uprising of Shiites in Najaf and a nationalist uprising of Sunnis in Fallujah. And the US military was defeated on both fronts. The Marines had to withdraw humiliated from Fallujah, and the army was incapable of taking out Muqtada al-Sadr and the Many Army in Najaf. At that moment, we were interviewing many army fighters who said, because before the war, even on the left, a lot of the conventional wisdom was, one of the reasons why we shouldn't go in is because there's these century-old sectarian conflicts and this country's going to break apart and whatever. What actually happened was the invasion united Sunni and Shiite in resistance to the American occupation. So in Sadr City, in the mosques, when we were there, there were lines of people giving blood to be taken into Fallujah to support the resistance in Fallujah. They sent fighters there. There are hundreds and hundreds of Mehdi Army fighters who were martyrs in Fallujah. The Fallujis sent weapons and support down to the Shiite resistance in Najaf. It was a united Sunni and Shiite resistance. So April 2004, the Americans are defeated on 2 fronts. Their strategy instantly changes. Bremer is out, Negroponte's brought in, and he brings in his whole cabal from Latin America's dirty wars in the 80s. Negroponte, of course, was the ambassador to Honduras, who oversaw the terrorist war against the Contra war in Nicaragua, oversaw wars in El Salvador, oversaw death squads operating in Honduras itself, brought over General Steele, or Colonel Steele, who was involved in training death squads there, and Castile, who was a DEA agent who was involved in the drug wars in Colombia and Bolivia. So they bring him in and they do 2 things. First, they pass order number 72, I think it was, that incorporates the Shiite militias into the security forces. And they rush through elections that are structured to bring the most sectarian elements inside the Shiites into power. So the Supreme Council, Scahill, becomes basically controls the government. It's the largest group that dominates the coalition, the Shiite religious coalition that runs the government. And their militia, the militia of the Supreme Council, the Badr Brigade, 30,000 members strong, trained and formed by the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, are turned into elite counterterrorism units that are trained by Americans that are called the Wolf Brigade and the Scorpion Brigade and the Snake Brigade. And they bring with them a counterinsurgency policy and tactic that was formed in Latin America, which says that the way to take out a guerrilla or an insurgent is to drain the swamp, is to attack the civilian base on which they survive. So if there's a guerrilla functioning in an area, it's because the people support him. Someone's feeding him, someone's hiding him, so no one's snitching on him, someone's telling him the police are coming, someone, they're giving him logistical support of all kinds. Like if there is a place in Iraq where people are fighting against the Americans, it's because they're being supported by the people. So to take them out, you attack their civilian base. And that's what the Scorpion and the Wolf Brigade did. The neighborhoods in Baghdad where the Sunni insurgency was active, they terrorized them. They mortared houses. They would roll through town and they would arrest every military-age man, every man male between the age of like 12 or 14 and 65. They were horribly tortured. By the time the war really kicked off in 2006, 2007, when we were in Baghdad, there were days when 200 bodies would be found, horribly tortured and disfigured in the dumps in the streets and bloated and floating in the Tigris River in one day. By the end of 2006, 18,000 confirmed sectarian murders a month. It's confirmed, thousands and thousands more. So over the course of that sectarian fight, they effectively split the Sunni and the Shiite insurgency against each other. They turned their guns on each other. And the U.S. had picked which side they were backing. They'd taken the most sectarian elements inside the Shiites and they put them in power and armed and funded their militia. So the Sunnis were on the verge of being purged from Baghdad, on the verge of losing everything. Being left with Anbar, with no access to to oil. All the oil's in the Shiite south. They did the only thing they could do. They're outnumbered 2-to-1 by Shiite militias. And the Shiite militias are being armed and funded by Americans. They turn to the only military ally available to them, the only political ally who's capable of having any traction with against the Iraqi government, and that's the Americans. And so, I disagree kind of fundamentally about the nature of who the awakening militias are. But a lot of them were fighters who realized this. And allied with the Americans in order to have some kind of traction, some kind of political and military future in the country. So what we have now is, just to end since I'm out of time, a central government in Baghdad run by the elite sectarian Shiite parties and a security force composed of their militias on the one side, and in Anbar you have a group of princes, of tribal sheikhs, a tribal elite, the same tribal elite that Saddam used to control Anbar for him, who are in charge of a 100,000 member strong militia that was paid for by the U.S., and who have tens of millions of dollars worth of reconstruction contracts funneled through them. Every one of the awakening sheikhs is their business cards say contractor, because they're the ones who oversee all that. They maintain these massive patronage networks, and that's where their money and their power comes from. These are two fundamentally incompatible forms of power. So I agree with Arun that when the U.S. finally pulls out, that this division is a perpetual engine for violence and instability. And when the U.S. pulls out, there's going to be violence of some kind. The violence might happen before the U.S. pulls out. Whether the U.S. is capable of maintaining this contradiction suspended for any length of time, it remains fundamentally unclear. But the longer we stay there, the more entrenched and powerful these two sides become, and the more violent and impossible the resolution of this divide becomes. So, that's the spot we're left in, a tense and fraying truce between sectarian enemies at the end of a civil war that we basically engineered, who now hate and fear each other more than they hate us. And the media planting a flag of victory in a mountain of corpses in a city of walls.